Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. It is an especially great honor today to welcome Marilynne Robinson as our guest on Conversing. Marilynne Robinson is well known for many people because of both her novels and her essays. Her novels have been prize-winning. Perhaps best known is Gilead, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2005 and the National Book Critics Circle Award. But also her prize-winning novels such as Home, or her first novel entitled Housekeeping. She's also written a lot of nonfiction and works such as The Givenness of Things, and When I Was a Child, I Read Books. She was awarded with the National Humanities Medal in 2012, and when President Obama presented her with this award, he said that it was given for her grace and intelligence in writing. Well, indeed, those are qualities that come through in her writing in a remarkable way. And today we have the chance to discuss her most recent book entitled Reading Genesis. This is a long reflection on the book of Genesis and its mysteries, its joys, its hopes, its graces, and especially its vision of God's compassion and mercy, attentiveness, and commitment to human beings. Marilynne, what a great honor it is to have you. Welcome to Conversing.
It's a pleasure.
You know, I've been a great advocate and fan of your writing for some time, and this most recent book of yours, Reading Genesis, which is what we're going to be focused on in our discussion, is yet another really quite exquisite and extraordinary accomplishment. I certainly obviously think that the book of Genesis itself is quite a magnificent accomplishment for so many reasons that we'll explore, but so is your representation of it. And because I don't know whether our listeners will have read the book yet or not, I want to jump in part by some description. Partly it's fascinating because it is simply one long narrative on your part of the narrative of the book itself. And that's unusual for a book that has over 300 pages to have no chapter breaks and so forth. You see it and read it as one long narrative. I wonder if you could just start by the form of the book. I just was really taken by it and appreciated it very much.
Well, I just reading Genesis, for years without particularly intending to write about it, I became very struck by the effect in the narrative of the overarching time that is God's time.
Yes.
And then the very realistic, very human time that runs along the ground, so to speak, and the way that these things interact with each other, the way that the meaning is resolved out of the fact of God's presence in his own time, but always aware of ours, and that it repeats so often as a pattern in the text that it seemed to me most of the ways that people had of approaching it obscured the flow that is intrinsic to the narrative.
One of the things that comes from doing biblical studies, which I have done, is exactly what you've described, which is this sense of dividing up the text and segmenting it in various ways and subdividing it again. And that has its own utility, I suppose. But the thing that is fascinating about your reading is that it captures and gets us immediately and unbrokenly into the narrative of Genesis as it is unfolding. And I was really grateful for that for many different reasons, partly because it gets us into the experience of the text, not just to you as an observer of the text. It feels as though you're more like a guide as we walk through the text rather than study it and impose on it, let's say, systematic theological categories or even historical or literary categories. And instead, you experience the the drama as it is unfolding as represented in Genesis. Tell me, why Genesis? You have written many things, exalted things, I would say, but in any case, really quite remarkable things. And now a commentary of sorts. I hesitate to use the word commentary because I'm not sure that that's really the right word. But why Genesis? And then why write what I will, at least in quotes for our purposes, call a commentary? Why Genesis and why a commentary?
Well, Genesis is the foundational text. That God's self-revelation is the work of Genesis.
Yes.
And I'm very bothered by the idea that the things that the text does that are brilliant are seen as flaws or pastiches or something like that.
Yes.
For example, the creation narrative in the first chapter of Genesis, people will say that's by a different writer than the Genesis narratives that follow it. But it does a very brilliant thing, which is it proceeds from a great anomaly, the beginning of everything,
Yes.
to people on the ground hoeing and
Yes. Yeah.
and that's true. I mean, that is true. We came from a great cosmic singularity, and here we are doing our foolish and pedestrian things,
Yes.
And there is, a narrative that made sense of the passage of one thing into something qualitatively unlike it almost would be a falsification, an intrusion,
Yes.
The absolute difference between these parts of the text is the point. You know?
It's such a straightforward and assumed structure, which you don't defend or present itself. You just simply let it be what it is, which is part of the brilliance on your part, to let it just stand and make its own point, which it does. And I think for anybody who takes your text seriously, it's going to draw us into an experience of the text of Genesis itself, which is, by the way, printed in the King James Version in the book, that it draws us into that text as we're drawn into your text and vice versa. They're wonderfully intertwined. And you, for my sake, feel like simply a exceptionally wise, literary, and faithful spirit guiding and shepherding us to pay attention. And that's partly why the book ends up becoming so moving at so many different points.
Great material to work with, I mean, it's so intrinsically beautiful.
Right. Yes. What, for again the sake of any who might, I hope, pick up this book and read it, what is the importance, would you say, by the time you were finished, what is the importance that the story begins with, as you just said, a creation story and not in some other place in some other narrative? Is it simply just because it is the beginning, or is there something else that you would want to say about creation itself as a factor in the book of Genesis?
Right. Well, it lifts the conception of God out of the landscape and that would be usual for an ancient conception of God or a God,
Yes.
It makes him, using the name Elohim, for example, which is the universal God name,
Yes.
that just lifts him above what will necessarily be the implications of his attention to one family, which is that he's like a tribal god or something like that. This great assertion is made that he made heaven and earth,
Right.
And
right.
Mankind, womankind, as being not of one kind, but, being earth, being, mother, being universal in that sense,
Yes. Yeah.
It's absolutely a great problem when you consider a monotheism breaking in on a polytheistic world, and one whose religion basically moves over into magic or something for conjuration very, very easily and so on. To make this enormously cosmic assertion of the nature of God before the fact of his loving human beings and being aware of what they do and so on is established.
Yes, yes. Well, there is this movement, as you point out at several key points, where we begin with this cosmological sense of things, and then suddenly we're into the most granular of things. And it's that reality that is obviously in the mind of a poet like John Donne and other metaphysical poets who held these two things so vividly together in their own poetry. And it feels like it's the song that gets sung in the opening parts of Genesis, which in part shapes that sort of imagination, and in this case shapes the whole of the book of Genesis, or you could say the whole of the canon of Scripture, which holds these three things together throughout the whole arc of the story.
Phenomenally.
Breathtaking.
Truly.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yes. It is amazing. In fact, let me just pause there for just a moment and say that one of the things I found myself being freshly aware of was, for lack of a better word at the moment, simply the amazingness of the book of Genesis. That is, it is a book that catches me in amazement over and over and over and over again. And I don't know that there's any other biblical book that in the same way captures that sensitivity. It's laying out sort of the first terms, we might say, of how we read the canon itself, and wonder, especially wonder in relationship to the most incidental people and circumstances. That is a wonder.
So beautiful. Yes.
It is so beautiful. Yeah. You know, the text unfolds quickly in Genesis, and we start with good and very good, and soon we're into all kinds of trouble. And by the time we get through the fall and into the moment where God, or the text says that God saw the intentions of our heart and they were only evil always, that language is so profound to have gone from Genesis 1 to chapter 6 in Genesis, and to have held all of that so it comes from the glory to the ignominy of our humanity. I guess I would just like others to hear you say a bit about that arc, that the swiftness of it, the particularity of it. What's happening there that you are trying to really bring to the reader's attention?
Well, one of the things that was very much on my mind as a reason for writing the book is because people, they use very randomly and accidentally the Old Testament, including Genesis, to conjure this idea of a vindictive God, you know? And all of the prophets and Jesus, and there's the insistence that actually he's merciful and long-suffering, you know, and loving, you know? And I think that the narrative, which is kind of like a narrative about an adult relationship with a child or something like that, you know, where two different kinds of comprehension go into the thing happening, and the child never understanding how well he's loved, you know?
Right.
That seems to me to be really essential to Genesis, and then essential to Isaiah and so on. And there's this sort of childish delight people seem to take in making God into a sort of troll, you know, which is very disturbing. It's hard to wiggle people free from the idea that God is primarily threatening and so on, you know? And I think that it's a terrible loss, loss.
I've been thinking a lot about fear recently because of some work that I'm doing, and the presence of fear so ubiquitously around the world and in our own nation. And then putting all of that in my mind in relationship to the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom, which comes from Proverbs, not Genesis. But the setup that Genesis provides is a setup that starts with this wonder over who God actually is and how God meets us, not the terror of God as someone to be hidden from, but as somebody to be known and to be known by. And it's a dynamic, that role of fear is a dynamic really through the whole of Genesis in various ways. People being fearful of one another, people being fearful of what God may do, but particularly of what they might do to one another. I'm curious, when you go back to the temptation itself in Genesis 3, would you say fear is a feature of that temptation, or is it really, in the more classical way that it's been defined often, just a story of ego?
I'm pretty committed to the idea that an aspect of our existence that God created is our ability to act against God,
Yes.
that he did not make us automatons or,
Yes.
And I think that, the story is set up in a way that sort of makes it an understandable curiosity. Why this tree? Why not other trees? And so on,
Yes.
And it also goes as far as possible to relieve it of the quality of serious sinfulness. And I know that we've clapped all kinds of other meanings on it, but basically, they disobey by taking an apple, one of perhaps a million apples in the same orchard, And I think that dramatizes the fact that even at the very beginning, we could act freely. We could act, and freedom for our purposes in many cases means resistance to God,
Yes.
I mean, as with, Moses and the prophets and so many things.
Yes.
Everything, really.
Right.
So, yeah. So I think the fall is, in a way, it's a sort of realization of a fuller aspect of our nature, which is painful to us and painful to God, but it's our humanity. It's why we're not simply, the little cosmic, dependence on the Creator.
Yes. Yes. Since you don't have a copy of the book at hand, let me take the liberty to read a portion of the text. This is found on page 139. The narrative of Scripture has moved with astonishing speed from let there be light to this intimate scene of shared grief and haplessness. There is no incongruity in this. Human beings are at the center of it all. Love and grief are, in this infinite creation, things of the kind we share with God. The fact that they have their being in the deepest reaches of our extensionless and undiscoverable souls only makes them more astonishing. Over and against the roaring cosmos, that they exist at all can only be proof of a tender solicitude. Do you want to say more about that theme, that it's really the book of Genesis, and by extension, I would say the Bible, but let's just say the book of Genesis is about human beings at the center? Just say more about that, please.
Well, it's something that really is striking over against other ancient Near Eastern mythologies, where we do chores, we're an afterthought, that the main business of life is among these gods that are always,
right,
beating each other bloody and so on, And the assertion that we are images of God and so on, and in the very exalted terms in which this is originally said and so on. That's as amazing as the creation out of nothing. It's and what it. I'm sort of thinking about Calvin these days. I guess I'm going to write something about him. But the way that the God on the one hand and the creature that defines him, because it is his image, on the other hand, like the sun and the moon on opposite horizons.
Right.
A beautiful framing, and the kind of literary tactic that the Genesis uses that means, meaning cannot leak out of this. This is absolutely meaningful,
Right.
That's so beautiful.
What a wonderful phrase, meaning cannot leak out of this. It really is that compression and intimacy that you're describing. Very powerful. I think that one of the things that is so striking to me, I came to faith as an adult, and as I began reading the whole of the Bible, I was really struck again and again by how much this text felt like it knew me, that it knew myself much more than I knew myself, and that it was a text that was written obviously in a time, place, and circumstances wildly different than my own, and yet it carried and invited me into the depth of my being because of the way that it knew me. And certainly Genesis does that in such a particular series of stories that are stories of the tumbling, bumbling, faithful, faithless, violent, peaceable, loyal, disloyal agency of human beings, all in the context of having been made by a God who, as you say, is the creator of all things. That combination is it's just breathtaking. When you think about the impact of Genesis just on you as a reader and also as this writer of this book, How does that dynamic, the sense of what we've been talking about for the last several minutes, this combination of God as God over all and God as most present and tangibly at work amidst, present with free human beings. How has that shaped you over the years?
Well, it's kind of hard to say, and I'm sure it's shaped me pretty profoundly, if that's the word. I mean, I really can't. The mystery of the holy image of a human being, that nothing is more important to me than that as a writer.
Yes.
It really closes off all kinds of unworthy options that you would have in the treatment of your characters and the quality of their perception and all the rest.
Yes. Yes.
Their mysterious beauty, that is simply a fact of human existence in every individual case.
Right.
And then I like the old conception of reality as being a vision,
Yes.
a revelation. And I was just reading, I think it was Plato talking to one of those Thrasymachos or somebody who said he only believed there was a God because when he looked at things, he saw the hand of an artist,
Yes. Yes.
And I think that you look at things with a generous eye and you do see the hand of an artist. It's so beautiful.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. One of the things that struck me as I was reading this was that it sort of explained the prologue to Gilead, and that really Gilead, your book of such note and such importance to so many people, is a book that feels like it arises within this narrative and feels like Genesis is what holds and articulates and manifests in the biblical canon the substance and detail and ordinariness, the beautiful ordinariness of a God-fashioned creature in ordinary communion with one another. Is that the way I might read those two things together, or do you see them related in a somewhat different way than that?
No, I think that you've described it very pleasingly, actually. My religious history has been so sort of inward in a way, But I remember when it seemed to me more important than anything to give in my imagination an absolute dignity to any life that I considered,
Yes.
That sounds very abstract and so on, but I think that it's, I think it's a highly defensible view.
Right. One of the things that also struck me is that later in the book, Genesis now we're talking about, later in the book, there's a place where, again, I wish these were your voice reading these words, but let me read a paragraph that comes about past midway in the book. It says this: Genesis can hardly be said to end. In it, certain things are established: the nature of creation and the spirit in which it was made, the nature of humankind, how and in what spirit the Creator God enters into relation with his human creatures. The whole great literature of Scripture, unfolding over centuries, will proceed on the terms established in this book. So Genesis is carried forward in the law and in the Psalms, in the prophets, itself a spectacular burst of light without antecedent, but with a universe of consequences. That kind of summary, in a certain way, of Genesis is not only about Genesis, but it is also about the impact of Genesis in the history of the West, but also everywhere that the Bible and the gospel of Jesus Christ has gone forth in the world. And it parallels and doesn't parallel other voices and other stories. But in the way you describe it, it captures, in my mind, in a very succinct way, this sense of the profundity of Genesis and its outworking implications in shaping worlds of understanding, relationships, etc., while still granting a great deal of freedom for what we are allowed to do and be as human beings. Can you say a bit more about that?
Well, I'm working on a book about Exodus, which I consider to be really the second half of the book about Genesis,
Yes, yes.
And the issue of our freedom as human beings is very much on my mind. And one of the things that's striking, considering the Bible as a whole, is that there's so little that is legalistic, so little lawfulness in Genesis. Adam should not kill Adam, and that sort of thing. But then you have Moses and the great liberation being the great metaphor for the whole thing, And then his design for the liberation of people, God's design, I would say, is law, because it does not modify you. You know what I mean? At any point, God could have said, I'm going to deprive these people of the ability to go wrong. I'm going to, He never does that. There's always this very great tact whereby, by some means or another, we remain our strange selves,
Yeah.
Moses does everything lawfully in order to free people, like leaving food for the alien and all the rest of it, but also erasing debt and enslavement at intervals, at short intervals by the standards that apply. But I think that we don't think about law when it is legitimately made as being a liberation of one another. If you internalize, thou shalt not kill, then everybody's safe. If you internalize thou shalt not steal. So in other words, if you subscribe to the law, you can think of it as limiting your behavior, but it is enormously emancipating to everyone around you.
Yes.
And also with the law, as the Bible is constantly mindful of, you can abandon it, you can transgress against it. It's like God's patience, it's there.
The dynamics of how freedom works has always been probably a central mystery to me as a person of faith. And while I value faith, while I value freedom, I'm also aware that I don't think I do value it nearly as highly as God seems to value it. And if I was the maker of all things, I think I would have curtailed freedom a bit more, because not just I, but we have made and do make such a mess of things in freedom. I understand the theology of freedom as necessary for the sake of love. I embrace that too. But I also find freedom an enigma. I wonder if you could just say a bit more about how you were taken by the themes of freedom in Genesis as you were working on this book.
Well, transgression in Genesis is a very sad thing. It's an injury to this family, these people alone in the world with this one great realization that they gain and lose and gain and lose,
Yes.
I think that God, through the Bible, understands freedom as a problem. For example, we should not eat from the tree of life and live forever, and from the very beginning, the Bible seems aware that we are our enemy and that we are our apocalyptic beast. And the narrative rounds off. There is no assumption that we will survive our deficiencies finally, except if God chooses to give us another life. But our freedom is very costly. It's costly to us. It's obviously costly to God also, who sends his son, to try I don't know. To say that God tries to do something and then it doesn't work somehow falls outside of my theology. But nevertheless, in shorthand, that's kind of what we have to consider. Who knows how the narrative will all work out. But clearly, the only begotten Son, that's a potent phrase after you've read that far in the Bible.
Yes. When I think about as a pastor, I've been in so many contexts with people where freedom is at the core of the problem or the crisis, right? It's something that has happened in freedom that has often wreaked such difficulty for the person themselves or for others that they know or love or have encountered. And when I watch all that sort of activity, or when I watch it more distantly in the world around me, I'm also just aware that there's something beautiful about this, because there's a sense that it is a manifestation of the fullness of what being a human being in the image of God really is and is capable of doing and being. But there's also something that feels to me regularly so tragic about the way that it unfolds and what it takes to sustain a life, which I think is part of the purpose of the law, of sustaining an imagination for goodness, which is part of the human need, at least, however we choose to do that. And certainly in a Jewish and Christian setting, the imagination is stimulated by the law. The imagination is stimulated by the good works of God's faithfulness over time, and ultimately, from a Christian point of view, sustained by God's faithfulness in Christ. And the cultivation of imagination is a very big theme in your writing, it seems to me, not just here where it's present in a different way, but in your novels and so forth, in some of your essays, certainly. I guess I'm just curious if you could just say a bit more about this dynamic of freedom and how you cultivate an imagination for life and not for death.
I'm aware of Calvin disputing the idea that there's anything physical about our being images of God. In our mind and imagination and so on, we are images of God. And I think that should induce, and in the best of the reformers, it certainly did induce a sanctification of consciousness, of oneself. They had this very strong sense of conscience, very powerful. Mm-hmm. And it was where they consulted with God, and they that they had no doubt that this is what was happening. And I think that a sort of enhanced reverence for oneself, that for my purposes or for my imagination has to be rooted in a reverence for God, that this our other self, in a sense. I think that it frees the imagination by giving us such a generous sense of what the imagination is, that it's cosmic also, that I think that, frankly, if I had to say the one thing that in my long life I have felt had kind of evaporated out of our culture, it's reverence, a predisposition to, there really is nothing like it, and nothing corresponds to it. It's only itself, and it has to exist with reference to the idea of the holy. And I think that, I read what I can understand of new physics, of quantum physics and so on.
Yes.
And it's a beautiful model in my mind, and I'm aware of the risks of bringing scientific terms into religious arguments and so on. But the idea of this sort of array of probability that then narrows itself down to one reality,
Right.
This seems to me like, when you think about everything to do with our existence, really, that it's proportioned to us, that we can manipulate it. There's nothing, out of all the things possible in the universe, that's an amazing thing to have manifested itself, And I think that, in a certain sense, we are the reality we experience has sort of passed through a sieve, through a veil, and left almost all possibility behind and become simply itself. Yes. And God is of the realm of infinite possibility, Yes. Yes. And thinking in those terms helps me to realize, I really do think, what imagination and conscience and so on must have felt like to people like William Ames and so on, who were so profoundly invested in, so utterly invested in the idea of the sacredness of God and the sacredness of the self.
The words that you use about conscience and about imagination and about self-awareness is in such a turbulent state right now, it seems to me, in the intellectual and social landscape, the political landscape of America. And so much of what is partly shaping a lot of the fear has to do with categories that have caused people to shelter and hide rather than to expand and imagine and be curious and in that sense to be reverent, to express curiosity out of a reverence of the other person and their experience, their story, their context, whatever it might be. And I do think, again, that one of the things that was interacting in my mind as I was reading Genesis and also thinking particularly about Gilead was the way that you are holding in your imagination for any contemporary readers and helping us to see, feel, and hear the voices and see the actions of ordinary human beings who are both, like Psalm 8, a little lower than the angels, and at the same time, we are dust, and to dust we will return. And the combination of those two things is very powerful to me. And it felt like as I was saying earlier, there's a sense that Genesis is the animating force behind that. So when I read this sentence that I read from a few moments ago about the way that it unfolds with a universe of consequences, I was just taken by the fact that that is the world that you're living in. And part of the gift that I think you yourself and your writing is providing in the world is a taste of that, which very few writers are able to bring forth, I think, in the way that you are. And I'm just extremely grateful for that combination.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Were you nurtured as a person in paying attention? Was that something externally nurtured, or was that just something in you that you would be such an observant and attentive person to God and to the world?
I don't know if I could answer that question. I grew up in the mountains of northern Idaho, in a place where many people lived because it's very beautiful,
Yes.
And I was always aware of the people around me being very aware of the woods and the lakes and all the rest. I think I was probably left alone more than a modern child would be. I spent a lot of time just hanging around in the backyard or something,
Right.
And being, knowing that these great forests were all around me on every side and so on, so venerable seeming. But in any case, I thought my own thoughts and read my own books and so on and was, not interrupted. And I think that's basically when I got most of my religious thinking done, frankly. I found when I went to reading, especially magisterial Reformation thought, I just loved it. I just felt at home in it immediately.
Yes. Well, I know you've only recently moved to California, so maybe California will provide its own delicious places and moments of contemplation and reflection on nature. I used to go every year to Yosemite for a few days of what I called granite therapy, which was just the experience of beholding granite in that immensity and letting it contextualize my life and the world that I was living in of constant change to stand before a wall of unchanging or relatively unchanging granite. Let me ask, by the time you come to the end of the book of Genesis with the story of Joseph, there's so much that has happened, and you, I think, really, with great beauty, draw us through the Joseph narrative and all of its implications, which is the longest section of any given part of the story in Genesis. And because we live at a time when there seems to be so much wrong that has been done to people by other people, I guess I wonder, as I was reading the book, wondering if you could play with this imaginatively for a minute, how Joseph might help us in this moment where there is so much of a tendency to blame and curse. And in this remarkable way, in the Joseph story, God brings Joseph to a point of doing neither of those two things. How might he speak to us, or how might that section of Genesis particularly speak to this time with so much blaming and anger and rage going on?
I wish I knew. One of the things that the Bible does that people, it's important. People take it seriously or they don't, but everybody's a brother, Everybody's descended from Adam. And the fact, it's the meeting of Esau and Jacob and so on. I mean, those things are, however threat might hang around them a little bit and so on, or very much even, it's still very emotionally gratifying that the brothers embrace,
Yes, yes.
And when the text is allowing you to be happy with your species, I think it's, it is because brothers embrace. It's not because somebody attains a certain rank in Egypt or something like that,
Right. Right.
And I think that we have to go back to the very basic thing of understanding our shared humanity.
Yes.
And we've departed a long way from that, even the best of us, I'm afraid. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it is just stunning. I mean, we are such a danger to everything we value. We are a danger to everything we value, And the fact that we can persist in doing that or tolerating it, but there we are, we've always been strange, we human beings,
Right. Back to the peculiarity of and perplexity of freedom.
Right.
I mean, I do think that in the story of Joseph in particular, there's really the long agony of years and years of isolation, and where the fertile ground for Joseph could so easily have been simply taken up with the anger and bitterness that he could have been carrying. And the text doesn't really say a lot about Joseph's inner life and how it was that he was working.
No.
What it does say is that he got on with life in a constructive way, in a context of service, in a context of serious responsibility and recognition. And his identity was being lived out. Even the legacy of his identity in the best ways was being lived out. Meanwhile, this unfinished story with the brothers and his father continues to linger until eventually it gets resolved. Is that a bow at the end of Genesis, or is there something? Is it better understood in some other way? Meaning, is it a way of wrapping up the intentions of Genesis to have that be the final piece with a sense of resolution? Or is there something more or different than that you think is happening in the impact of the Joseph story overall in Genesis?
I think that the way that Joseph understands his history, is a comment on the idea of divine time,
Yes.
That what we see is not something that we can really extrapolate from. It's also true that, for one thing, and it startles most people when they come across it, Joseph did enslave the Egyptians.
Yes. Right.
And that's a big counterweight to the fact that the Egyptians enslaved the Hebrews,
Yes.
I mean, to have that pop up in the text, what a surprise. But it's so fair-minded in that way,
Yes.
And then there's also the great fact that, Jacob is entombed and all the rest of it, probably would not have pleased him at all. But this is the opening up of the great disappearance into Egypt, the great, So, I mean, those two things by themselves means that Genesis has not lost its realism,
Right.
that there is no bow to tie around anything. There's simply whatever it yields in terms of meaning and beauty and so on.
When you were writing about that, I was reminded of that section at the end of Matthew 28, when you might be thinking this Great Commission, which has been treated in all kinds of ways that sometimes verge on empire more than it verges on what it really calls us to do as servants. But the text says, and then Jesus gathered with the 11, not the perfect number, and they believed and doubted. Those are the people that God gives the Great Commission to. And often we only hear the Great Commission. So I guess I'm putting that in parallel to say we sometimes are only used to hearing the Joseph story in the positive sense of resolution being the end of Genesis, rather than it actually being the very bridge into the enslavement that defines Israel for generations.
Exactly. Which it's so subtle, it's so like how things happen,
Yeah.
I mean, even like Christianity sliding into empire and all these kinds of things. It's very, very realistic in so many ways.
Marilynne Robinson, thank you so much for being a guest and conversing. I wish this conversation could last for about 5 hours, and that we could go through your book in a much more granular way. I do think it's an extraordinary contribution. I have several books that I reread every year, and I'm now, I think, going to add this to my annual reads, because there's a way that, like the other things that I read annually, which include Lear, it includes about half of Shakespeare, including Lear, but it also includes Augustine's Confessions and a rotating set of books that are maybe not every year. But this book really, really captured something that I was hungering for, and which was just magnificently fulfilled. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's been a great pleasure. It's been an honor.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.